Today's podcast is one that I've been looking forward to for quite some time now. We are going to be talking about 10 lessons and ideas that I've learned from Jocko Willink over the past 10 years. So if you don't know who Jocko is a retired Navy SEAL. He is probably most well known for his work in the Battle of Ramadi in 2006, where he led Task Unit Bruiser. He was in the SEAL teams for a decent amount of time before that. And he also, after that deployment to Ramadi, he was the lead instructor for the land warfare training that Navy SEALs would go through before their deployment. And he often talks about how much of a leadership lab that was, and where he got to really work on developing leaders and passing on the lessons he learned from his career in the Battle of Ramadi and trying to pass those on to the next generation of SEAL leaders. He ends up retiring from the military in 2010, I think it may have been 2011, and he starts his leadership consulting company called Echelon Front, which is an absolutely fantastic company. I've been to one of their events before. It's called Muster. I can't recommend it enough. But really, with Echelon Front, what he started doing was taking those leadership lessons that he learned during his time in the military and that land warfare training and the Battle of Ramadi and all those experiences in the military, and worked on applying those same leadership lessons and principles to business. If you read the book Extreme Ownership, it does a great job of taking those lessons and military stories and relating them to stories that they've come across while they've been helping businesses since, like I said, 2010. So that's a little bit of background on Jocko and who he is and what his career is, or what his career has looked like. Now, when I came across Jocko, it was the fall of 2015. So he was on the Tim Ferriss podcast, I believe, first, and then he went on Joe Rogan, and he also released his book, Extreme Ownership, which was the first one of the many books that he has written. But he released that, I want to say it was October 20th of 2015, which is kind of why I've been waiting till about this time to record and publish this podcast to kind of celebrate the 10-year anniversary of this book and just of the fall of 2015, where Jocko was made his first podcast appearances, wrote his first book, and started his podcast. And since 2015, I've probably listened to thousands of hours of the Jocko podcast. And I guess I should probably take a second to kind of talk about what drew me to his podcast at the time, because when I listened to him on Tim Ferriss and I listened to him on Joe Rogan, I wasn't necessarily looking for a podcast about leadership lessons and about human nature. I was more drawn to just Jocko's perspective on the world. It was really interesting to hear someone who had the life experiences that Jocko had, being a Navy SEAL, uh, being in the Battle of Ramadi and leading those soldiers. It was really interesting to just hear his perspective and hear the lessons that he learned, and also the history that he covered on the podcast and how he thought about war. It was all just fascinating to me. And luckily for me, he would tie in a bunch of leadership lessons from other people and as well as his own experiences into all of these different stories from history, right? Whether it's, I want to say it's his second podcast where he covers the book About Face, which is a book by David Hackworth, who led guys in the Vietnam War. And there's just fantastic stories from that book. Jocko does a great job covering this situation where David Hackworth goes into a unit and essentially does a great job of turning around the culture of this unit in Vietnam. He does a great job covering a bunch of different books from the Vietnam War, the Korean War, World War I, World War II, books about just Chesty Puller in the Marines, books about Dick Winters from Band of Brothers in World War II. Just a ton of books that he's covered on his podcast and stories to learn from. He just, like I said, he does a great job telling you the history of the stories and passing on the lessons that he learned, and also the lessons learned from all of those figures throughout history. So, like I mentioned, I've listened to thousands of hours of Jocko's podcast. I'm not sure how many thousands, but I would imagine I'm probably up there in total time watched and listened to of Jocko podcast. Not to say that I've done a better job than anyone at really digesting them and applying them, but it's definitely been, outside of my parents, probably the thing that has formed my view of the world and how I operate in the world, and yeah, just how I interface with the world has been highly influenced by Jocko and his teachings. So for this podcast, like I said, I wanted to just think of, without going back through the books, without looking through all my notes, just kind of think about, hey, what are the 10 ideas and lessons that have really stuck with me the most, that are at the top of my mind when I think about the things that I've learned from Jocko over the past 10 years. So that's what we're going to dive into today. We'll hit on those top 10 ideas and takeaways. And then I should mention, obviously, it's not going to cover all of the takeaways that I have from Jocko. That list would probably span easily into the hundreds, hopefully over time, as I get better at podcasting, as I get better at digesting this information and working on articulating it and communicating it. I'm sure in the future, hopefully a couple hundred podcasts from now, I'll be able to do a much better job of articulating the lessons that I have from Jocko. But with that, let's dive in on the 10 lessons that I've learned from Jocko over the past 10 years. So number one, this is the one that comes to the top of mind first, is this idea of making things happen. So Jocko often tells the story. I mean, I need to track down how many podcasts he tells it on. There's probably not an easy way to do it. Maybe ChatGPT can now. But one of the stories that he repeats all the time is a story from his time at land warfare training. And this is a story that he says happened pretty often with the guys that he would put through the training. And so he'd be putting these guys, they'd be on some, practice mission essentially, and bullets are flying and there's chaos. And Jocko always talks about how he would try to make these situations that he would put the guys through as chaotic as possible, because he wanted his land warfare training to be harder than anything that they were going to experience overseas. And so he would essentially kind of, design these situations where leaders needed to step up and make calls. And he talks about how there would be times where, maybe the task unit commander or an officer who's in charge to make decisions is busy doing whatever he's busy doing. And there would be a group of frontline soldiers who are kind of sitting there not doing anything and waiting for somebody to make a call and tell them what needs to get done. And he would talk about how he would just walk up to these group of guys and ask the question, hey guys, like, what do you think you should be doing right now? And they would either say, hey, we need to go take that building, or we need to flank these guys over here. They would have an idea of what the thing that they should do next was, but they weren't doing it. They were just sitting there and waiting to be told what to do. And Jocko talks about how he would just walk up and tell them, hey, make it happen. Go make that thing happen. What the next thing you need to do is go make it happen. And he talks about how he would see like the light bulb click in those guys' eyes of like, hey, I'm allowed to actually go do that. Like, I didn't think I had the authority to just go ahead and make things happen. And Jocko would, he had that opportunity over and over and over again to see that light bulb go off in people's heads of like, oh, okay, like I can actually go and make these things happen and make calls and kind of force these things that I think should happen to happen. So that's, like I said, that's a story that he tells all the time. And it's, ever since I started this podcast, as I go through the books, I kind of mark down instances of stories where other people are talking about those lessons. And one of the books I've read, I actually haven't done a podcast on this book yet, but John D. Rockefeller, we covered him on podcast 19 in the book Titan. He writes 38 letters to his son, and letter number 4 is all about this idea of making things happen and getting after it and having this, bias for action, as some people would say it. And one of the things that John D. Rockefeller says in that letter is smart people will only make things happen. He talks about how, if you're a smart person, the first thing you're going to do is go make things happen. And you know that you're not going to have the perfect plan, but you need to make things happen, right? We also covered on podcast number 20, we talked about Jensen Huang and NVIDIA. And one of the things that Jensen said was the secret to NVIDIA's success was nothing more than sheer will. Jocko would say, using your force of will to make things happen. Whatever it is that you think should happen, go freaking make it happen. Be a force of will and go execute on what you think needs to be executed. So over my 10-year career, I think that's probably the top lesson that I've learned from Jocko is, hey, if you think that something should be done and you think that you have some kind of idea or plan as to what should be done, go make it happen. It seems so simple. Most of these ideas will seem simple, but I feel very lucky to have heard that story over and over and over again from Jocko. As David Sinner would say, repetition is persuasive. I think I was very lucky to hear that story over and over and over again because over the course of the past decade, that story alone has had a big impact on how I operate with other people and within groups of people. So, like I said, make things happen. That's the number one kind of top thing or top takeaway for me from Jocko. Right. Takeaway number 2 is to read and write every single day. So this was something that was actually in Tim Ferriss's book. Here, I've got it right here. This is in Tim Ferriss's book, Tribe of Mentors. Jocko is one of the people in this book that he asked questions. So essentially, this entire book, he asks a bunch of people who are really good at their craft to answer a series of questions. And one of the questions in the book is, in the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior, or habit has most improved your life? And Jocko's response is reading and writing every day. Free your mind. And so I thought that was super interesting is, hey, here's this guy. And I don't know if you've seen a picture of Jocko. He just looks like essentially the Hulk. He's super strong, just looks like a monster of a man. He's like the poster boy, I would imagine, of like what you would think a Navy SEAL would look like. He looks like the last person you would ever want to get into an altercation with. And this is the guy who is emphasizing how important it is to read and write every single day. And I think it's really interesting. One of the things Jocko talks about often is he started in the Navy as an enlisted guy. And then when he was, I want to say 29 or 30 years old, he ends up going to college because he's going to end up becoming an officer in the military. And when he goes to college, he goes and studies English. And I thought that was really interesting to study English. I mean, for me as a kid, English was by far my worst subject. It was the last thing I wanted to get near. I was much more of a math and science kind of guy. So I thought it was really interesting. But Jocko has a really good explanation for why he wanted to study English. He talks about how, if you're an officer in the military, your ability to write is what is going to determine if people get medals or not, right? So you write down like, hey, this guy did this, that, and the other thing, and I believe he deserves a Bronze Star or a Silver Star or whatever medal it is. The same thing with promotions. If you want a guy to be promoted, you need to be able to write him good, whatever their equivalent of a performance review is. I forget exactly what it's called. But it's also same thing about telling the guys in the field what to do. He talks about how he had to take the rules of engagement, that's like this complicated legal document, and be able to kind of simplify that and communicate it with his guys. So he knew when he was going to college by the age of 29 or 30, how important being good at English and understanding the language and being able to articulate yourself and communicate that. He saw the value in that very early on. And so I just think it's really interesting when you think of like a big, strong guy, like I said, who's a Navy SEAL and fights jujitsu all the time. It's really interesting to hear him say how important it is to read and write. And there's this hilarious story from Tim Ferriss where he tells the story of when Jocko stayed the night at his house following their podcast interview in 2015. Tim Ferriss talks about how he got a text message from his girlfriend the next morning at 8 a.m. and it said, I think Jocko's been up reading for 5 hours already. What should I do? And so Jocko, after this interview, after this podcast, which, like I said, I think it's the first podcast he ever does, it's with Tim Ferriss. He wakes up 3 o'clock the next morning and starts reading his books. And what's really interesting to think about on that front is, number one, I'm not sure if Jocko by the next morning had already decided if he wanted to start his own podcast. But assuming he wasn't, that means that he just happened to be reading for 5 hours for the sake of reading, right? Because once he starts his podcast, and I'll touch on it now, his first couple podcasts were all diving in on books. And now that I've done a few podcasts where I cover books, I can tell you it takes a good amount of time to read a book, take all the lessons that you've learned from it, digest that down into whatever it is, 1 hour or 2 hours, and be able to articulate the lessons that you learned from that book. That takes a lot of time to do. And so I don't think that he was preparing for a podcast yet at this time, because it would have been literally the day before where he had first gotten the suggestion from Tim Ferriss that he should do his own podcast. So he's just up reading for 5 hours for the sake of getting smarter and understanding the world and human nature better for himself. So just like I said, very interesting to hear him talk about the importance of reading and writing and the influence that it's had on his life. And I probably listened to Jocko podcast for 7 years before that lesson from Jocko finally clicked for me. I was doing the reading part for a good chunk of it, but I didn't really start writing on my own until 2023 timeframe. So even with Jocko saying that and him talking about the importance of English and the importance of reading and writing every single day, it still took me a very long time to get to the point where I was actually writing. And now that I've started, it's definitely one of those things I wish I would have started it sooner, because it's really helped me understand my perspective of the world and really shown me how poor I am at articulating and communicating my thoughts, and how little I really know about the world. Because as you read more, as you write more, you kind of realize that your circle of competence and what you know is much smaller relative to the cumulative knowledge of the world that is out there. So this also ties into other things that we've talked about on the podcast, right? So we talked about Naval. One of the quotes that I really loved from Naval is the one where he says, "I probably read 1 to 2 hours a day. This puts me in the top 0.00001%. I think that alone counts for any material success I've had in my life and any intelligence I might have. Making it an actual habit is the most important thing," right? So just there's a bunch of people that we've covered on this podcast that talk about the importance of reading, understanding reading, and also the importance of writing, right? We talked about John D. Rockefeller, how many iterations he would go through on the letters that he wrote to people to make sure that there was no extra word or no unneeded word on there, and that he had the words and the sentences in order so that it communicated exactly what he was trying to communicate. So that's idea number 2, this idea of reading and writing every single day. Idea number 3, this is an idea called "You Are the General." So there was a time period, I actually don't remember when it was. It was probably 2022 or 2023. I should look it up. But Jocko came out with this series of like 2 to 4 minute videos called the Standard Directives. And one of the early videos in that series was this video called "You Are the General." And in this video, Jocko talks about how you are both the general and the soldier in your own life. And really what he means by that is like, hey, on the general side, you're the guy that needs to come up with the plan, to come up with the strategy and the long-term vision for what is going to happen and how that is going to get executed. And you need to write down those orders and figure out what is the list of things that need to happen. And at the same time, you are also the soldier. And on the soldier side, you're the guy that needs to go execute on those orders. And so he kind of has this frame of you are the general and the soldier in your own life. And it's an interesting kind of thought process to think of yourself as these two separate people. And there's a few examples that he gives that I think was really useful for me in understanding kind of this dynamic and how to work with yourself through this lens of being both the general and the soldier. One example is he talks about task lists. So he says he doesn't do it as much anymore, but especially early on in his career, he was big on writing down the tasks that he needed to do. And then that way, when he went into soldier mode, he would just do them. So at the end of the day, last 10 minutes of the day or whatever, he would write down, hey, these are the things that I need to get done tomorrow. This is me putting my general hat on, and I'm saying, I know what the mission is. I know where we're going. These are the things that need to get done. Here's the task list. And tomorrow, when I start getting after it for work, I'm going to go into soldier mode, and I'm not going to debate whether these things are the things that should be done. The general yesterday decided that those were the things that needed to happen. What I need to do right now is dive into executing on these tasks that I, as the general, have laid out for myself. So that was one. And then I think the second example, which I love, is this example of the alarm clock in the morning. So he talks about, whenever he sets his alarm and it goes off at 4:30 in the morning. He's notorious for waking up early in the morning. If you go to his Instagram, you'll see a picture of his watch and it says like 4:34 a.m. Every morning, because that's the time that he gets down to the gym and starts working out. But he talks about how whenever that alarm goes off in the morning, he does not think at all about, oh, do I want to sleep in? I'm tired. I want to keep resting. My pillow's so soft. At that moment, he talks about how he's in soldier mode and he's just following orders. And he's like, my brain's not thinking at all. I'm just doing exactly what the general told me to. And the general told me that I'm waking up at 4:30. I don't have a say in this. I'm going to go work out and do what it is that I've laid out for myself to do. And so both of those examples are things that I've tried to apply to my life, right? Of whether it's making a task list or not negotiating with myself in the morning, kind of thinking of that dynamic of, hey, am I in general mode right now and I need to lay out the orders? Or am I in soldier mode right now where I need to execute on what's in front of me? And whenever you get into soldier mode, not letting your brain wander into general mode of like, oh, should I do this? Should I not do this? Because that can take you down a brain track that just leads you to wasting time. So that was a very useful tool for me. Write down your tasks, get that task list written down. Tomorrow, go and execute it. All right. Idea number 4. This is an idea that leadership is a skill. So this is something that Jocko talks about all the time. He talks about how a lot of different things are skills, right? Leadership, discipline. One of the quotes that I love from Jocko. He probably says it a few times because it stuck with me. He talks about how babies are not born, 9 pounds, blue eyes, and level 7 discipline, right? He talks about like discipline isn't something that you are born with and you have this certain capacity for when you are born. It is a skill that you learn to develop over time. And same thing with leadership. Leadership is a skill that you can get better at. There's a lot of counterintuitive ideas or maybe things that aren't our innate nature to do when it comes to leadership and working within groups of people. And so recognizing that, hey, leadership is a skill that needs to be developed just like anything else. I think that was a lesson that really stuck with me from Jocko. And kind of one of the analogies that I thought through for myself was, hey, kind of early in your career, you're building these skills, right? Whether it's, technical skills or sales or project management, or whatever that skill may be, software development. There's a bunch of different technical skills that you can learn and you can get really competent at those skills. And maybe, you go from white belt to blue belt to purple belt at a specific skill. We'll use kind of software development in this case. But then the day comes where you need to be a leader. And while maybe you've got this technical skill up to purple belt level, you're a white belt leader. And there's this kind of time where you have to recognize like, oh, I've got to, 1, start developing this skill of leadership, but 2, recognize and have the humility that I am going to mess up a bunch because I'm a white belt at leadership. I have not developed this skill. And for me to get to be a blue belt or a purple belt or wherever I want to be on the leadership skill spectrum, I'm going to fail a lot along the way. I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. And I think that idea was very comforting for me, I guess is the term that I'll use, that like, hey, just recognizing you're going to make a bunch of mistakes along the way. You are not just born an incredible leader. You're going to try, you're going to mess up, you're going to say the wrong things to people, you're going to not articulate things as well as you wish you had. And those are all things that you just need to accept and understand that it is part of the process of leadership development and developing your skill set in those areas. So I think that was an idea that really stuck with me, just viewing leadership as a skill that you can get better with in time if you put some intention into developing that skill. Idea number 5, this is an idea that I kind of call it's normal to feel that way. So this is one of those things that you probably would not think about Jocko if you haven't read his books and you haven't listened to his podcast and you just kind of think of him as the, super strong Navy SEAL, go to war and ultimate discipline type guy. One of the things he talks about is how important it is to communicate to other people that it is okay or normal to feel a certain way, and that we have all of these human emotions, and you are going to experience those emotions, and that is totally okay. And on podcast 424, he's covering this Air Force manual that's titled Psychological Aspects of War. And I think this part of the podcast does a really good job of kind of explaining this idea that Jock was talking about. It says, everyone who faces an emergency that threatens any of his important needs experiences fear. In a survival emergency, you may be constantly threatened with the loss of such basic needs as food, water, companionship, shelter, and even life itself. In a survival situation, you, like everyone else, will experience fear. That's kind of the part that Jocko was highlighting. Like, in a survival situation, you will experience fear. That is what this book is telling you. Like, it's normal to feel that way. You are going to experience fear. Back to the book. It says your fear will greatly influence your behavior, and your behavior, your chances of surviving. Fear cannot be removed by military order. It is a very natural response to danger. You must recognize fear, live with it, and if possible, use it to your advantage. You must accept fear as a normal reaction. It is not an emotion you need to be ashamed of. I think that's a really interesting line right there. You must accept fear as a normal reaction. It is not an emotion you need to be ashamed of. You must realize that you cannot avoid fear by denying that the danger causing it exists. You must realize that there is always something you can do to improve your situation. So that was a really good example, like I said, from Jocko podcast 424, that he covers this idea of communicating that it's normal to feel that way, and that you're going to have these emotions and these experiences that are going to cause you to react in certain ways, and that's totally normal. There's a few other examples, kind of two that I'll mention. I forget which podcast it's on. It's probably on podcast 424 as well, where he talks about scenarios in real life where he would tell people that. So number one would be with the UFC fighter. So if you don't know, Jocko is a black belt at jiu-jitsu, and he would actually help train and corner guys who are fighting in the UFC. And one of the things he talks about is, those guys before their match, obviously, they're about to get into a cage and physically fight another human being. Your body is going to be reacting to that and getting ready for it and getting pumped up for that event. And one of the things that he would make sure to tell guys is, hey, this is your body getting ready for war. This is your body doing what it's supposed to be doing, because you're about to go into that cage and fight another guy. And he talks about, like, hey, if you plant the wrong idea in that guy's head at that time, like if you go up to a UFC fighter before his fight and he's all amped up and you say, hey, dude, what's wrong with you? Why are you all amped up about this? You could send that guy into a tailspin. But one of the things you want to do is remind that person, hey, it's normal to feel this way. It's okay. That's your body getting ready for what you need to do. You're okay. Another example, very similar, similar in a way, would be when he would send guys outside the wire to go into, potentially get into a gunfight. Obviously you're going to have butterflies and all of those emotions that come with it. And same thing there, he would talk about how he would tell those guys, hey, this is your body getting ready for war. It's normal to feel antsy. It's normal to have kind of this energy and fear in you. That is a normal and appropriate response for the situation that you are in. And so that was just one of those ideas that it first really settled in for me from Jocko. So that idea of, like, hey, it's normal to feel that way, and making sure that you tell people, including yourself, that it is normal to have these certain emotions in these certain situations. All right, moving on to idea number 6. And this is the idea of the only leadership measure that actually matters. So this is actually a quote from the book, Extreme Ownership. Jocko and Leith, who's the co-author of the book, they write, the only meaningful measure for a leader is whether the team succeeds or fails. For all definitions, descriptions, and characterizations of leaders, there are only two that matter: effective and ineffective. And this is a really interesting idea. It seems like a simple idea, seems like an obvious one, but it's just a great reminder of, hey, at the end of the day, as a leader, your job is to get a team from A to B successfully, right? So, like, what is the goal, what is the next point you are trying to get to, and that is kind of what I'm calling B, and where are you at right now, and are you effectively getting the team to perform what it needs to perform to get that group of people to point B, whether that's a sales and revenue goal for a company, whether that's a mission in the military, whether it's a research project, whatever it is. The only measure that matters for a leader is that you effectively accomplish the goal that you set out to get. One of the podcasts that really reminded me of this idea was podcast number 13, where we cover Steve Jobs. And I talked about a story about how a professor at Texas A&M, the first business class that I ever sat in on syllabus day, the teacher talked about how Steve Jobs was a bad leader. And I remember just completely wondering how the professor of the very first business class I was taking was talking about how the leader of the world's most valuable company at the time was a bad leader, and how I was like, she must have a different definition of leadership than I do, because I mean, Steve Jobs literally built the most valuable company in the world by this point. And so I thought of this definition of like, hey, whether you like Steve Jobs' tactics and approach and how he went about doing things, I don't think you can really argue with the fact that he was effective at getting a group of people to do what they needed to do to accomplish the mission that they had set out to do, right? I mean, there was the 12-year stint where Steve Jobs was removed from Apple from 1985 to 1997, I think, where Apple did not do well. And by the time that Steve Jobs came back, they were within a few months of going insolvent, if I remember correctly. And so Steve Jobs came back and turned it around, was extremely effective at running that organization and making Apple into what it is today. So that definition, ties into the title of the book, Extreme Ownership. At the end of the day, as a leader, you've got to own whatever the results are from the work that you and your team are putting in. And at the end of the day, the only measure that matters for the leader is whether or not you were effective. So just one of those ideas that's really stuck with me over the years. All right. Idea number 7. This is an idea of leading up the chain of command. So this idea comes from the book Extreme Ownership, and Jocko talks about it all the time. But this idea that as a subordinate, you have the ability and you need to lead up the chain of command. This is one of the things that was really, really, really valuable for me early on in my career. Like we're talking 2015, 2016, when I was 1-2 years out of school. And this idea of like, hey, as a subordinate, it's your job to lead whoever your manager is, right? So there's a bunch of different stories that he tells to reinforce this and ideas. And a lot of times what that can look like is, hey, if you don't understand why your leadership is telling you to do a certain thing, just asking them like, hey, why are you asking me to do it this way? And trying to dig in and understand the perspective of your leadership team and why they're asking you to do things. That by itself, I think, is a form of leading up the chain of command, because it really helps the people above you understand that, one, you don't quite understand what they are asking you to do, and two, it kind of forces them or puts them in a position where they can kind of help themselves articulate what they are asking you to do. And we talked about earlier in this podcast, the first idea, make things happen, right? Hey, there's going to be a lot of times where the people above you, I mean, they've got jobs too. They've got a million things going on. And what are the things that you can take onto your plate without them needing to tell you to do it, right? What are those things that you can start taking charge of and leading and being the quarterback of those things, and then passing the deliverables and passing those things up the chain of command? I think there's this idea of leading up the chain of command really opened my eyes to how many opportunities there are to lead up the chain of command, right? And, now that I'm leading an organization, there's a lot of times where I think about how dependent I am on all of the folks who are on the team, right? Whether it's sales folks who are there on the front lines talking to customers every day. Everyone at the company relies on the sales guys of being that layer of, hey, this is what we are hearing from the market, right? It's the sales guy's job to take all of that input from the market and articulate that and communicate what they are hearing across and up and down the chain of command, right? That is on them. Like the organization needs those sales guys to do it. Same thing with customer experience, right? The customer experience team is the one who's fielding all these inbound calls from our customers and helping them through whatever issues they may be having. And so those people on the customer experience team, they know so much better than I do what's going on the front lines, and they can have the opportunity to lead up the chain of command, right? Take all of that feedback, communicate it, articulate it, and then be champions for whatever they think the company needs to do to help address all of the challenges that they're seeing on the front lines. And you can kind of take that same idea across any department within any company. It's like, hey, what are those things where you have the best view of what's going on, and how can you lead up the chain of command and make things happen on your own? So I think that was a really interesting idea for me. I still need to get better at articulating exactly how to do it. But like I said, it's a chapter in extreme ownership, and just that concept of leading up the chain of command. How can you help your boss and lead your boss instead of you just sitting there and expecting them to be the one leading you all the time? That idea just by itself had a really big effect on how I operate in the world. All right, moving on to idea number 8. And this is the idea of something Jocko calls leadership capital. And so leadership capital is essentially this analogy for relationships where you can think about every single interaction you have with somebody as you're either building leadership capital with them or you are losing leadership capital with them, right? So, hey, did whatever I just did that build my leadership capital with the team? Did I let somebody own a project? Did I let them run with their decision? Did I actually let them influence me to change how I was thinking about something? Like those are all examples of times where you probably gain leadership capital with somebody. Their respect for you goes up, and you can just think of it in the inverse, right? What are the things that other people do that result in you respecting them more or trusting them more, and result in them building their leadership capital with you, right? And one of the things Jocko talks about over and over and over again is how every single interaction that we have between two people, you're either building your leadership capital or you are losing your leadership capital. And so you want to make sure you are building that trust, building that respect as much as you can over time. And there should not be many times where you need to spend your leadership capital. Now, obviously, there will be times where you need to spend your leadership capital, but you want to be very careful on those times that you do, right? So I think that analogy has been really helpful in that frame of, hey, every single interaction, you're either gaining leadership capital or you're losing it. And I think another really interesting tie-in on this lesson is the idea that you have leadership capital with yourself as well. So one of the things Chris Williamson, who's another popular podcaster, he talks all the time about the importance of being able to keep promises that you make to yourself. So make yourself a promise and keep that promise. He talks about if you had a friend that always showed up late, you would not trust that friend. And he talks about how you have that same type of relationship with yourself, right? You need to have leadership capital with yourself so you trust yourself and respect yourself to do the things that you've set out to do, right? We talked about being the general and the soldier, right? You need to know that when the general writes down those orders, that the soldier is going to go execute those things. I think that's a really cool analogy for leadership capital within yourself. And there's this fantastic video of Conor McGregor. I don't know exactly when it is. It must have been earlier in his UFC fighting career. But there's this video where he's talking about just this. He says, don't say you need to do something and then not do it. Set a time to train and train at that time. Set a time to go to sleep and go to sleep at that time. Set a time to get up and get up at that time. Don't tell yourself you need to do something and then don't do it. That's what I was talking about. I said I knew in my head I was saying get up at this time. I didn't get up at that time. Train at this time. I didn't train at that time. Don't eat this. I ate that. Don't drink that. I drank that. And these all just infiltrate my mental strength. Little defeats instead of wins. And it just culminates into this, you don't want to be here. So I'm just figuring myself out like I've never figured myself out before. So I just love that quote. I think it's really interesting because you kind of see the emotion from Conor McGregor talking about how he was losing leadership capital with himself because he was telling himself, hey, I'm going to set this time to train, and he wouldn't do it. I'm going to go to bed this time. He didn't do it. I'm going to eat these things. didn't do that. I'm not going to drink. I end up drinking, right? He's talking about this process where throughout his training, he was losing leadership capital with himself. So I love this analogy. Like I said, leadership capital, remembering that it applies in every interaction you have with other people, and it also applies with every interaction that you have with yourself, making sure that you are building leadership capital with yourself and others instead of spending it. I just love that analogy. It's had a big effect on how like I said, operate in the world. All right, moving on to idea number 9. This one is the idea of keeping things simple. So we talked about this a lot on the podcast covering Steve Jobs and how he had this superpower of making things simple, right? We talked about how he removed the power buttons from products because it was unnecessary. And there's the fantastic story about how this illiterate 6-year-old was able to pick up an iPad and operate it without any instructions because Steve Jobs had done such a good job of making the product as simple as possible. On the Tim Ferriss podcast, one of the things that Tim Ferriss asked Jocko is, hey, what are you world class at? And one of the things Jocko initially responds with saying like, hey, I'm not sure I'm world class at anything. But he talks about if he had to kind of define 2 things that he thinks he excels at, number 1 is the ability to take complex things and make them simple. And number 2 is his ability to detach, right? So this idea of keeping things simple and not adding to the complexity is something Jocko talks about all the time. It's actually his second law of combat in the book, Extreme Ownership. And like I said, this is one of those lessons that if you listen to the Jocko podcast, he talks about it over and over and over again. There's just countless military examples that he talks about where people have these complex ideas and these complex plans and things fall apart because people, it's just too complex and it's hard to balance all those things in your head and keep track of very complex things. It's better just to keep things simple. And so, like I said, that's something Jocko just talks about over and over and over again, something I still have a ton of work to do. It's really interesting to see how much or at least my default programming is to make things more complex when in reality, you should just be making them as simple as possible. All right. And last idea number 10, this is the idea of studying atrocities. And so there's really probably 2 people that I've listened to that study and talk about atrocities in history a lot. Number 1 is Jocko, and number 2 is Jordan Peterson. And so very, very early on in Jocko's podcast, he starts covering, I'm talking like the first 100 episodes, which is interesting to say very early on. I mean, that's 2 years of doing podcasts. But he covers Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who was in the camps during World War II. He covers the My Lai Massacre, which is from 1968, where U.S. soldiers in Vietnam kill, I want to say it's like 500 Vietnamese civilians, women, and children. Just a brutal massacre that was performed by American soldiers. He covers Machete Season, which is on the Rwandan genocide, where about 800,000 people were slaughtered. He covers Unit 731 from World War II in Japan. He covers Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. That's talking about the group of ordinary police officers that end up killing Jews in World War II. He covers Gulag Archipelago. The list goes on of atrocities that Jocko has studied and talked about on his podcast, which, like I said, is very interesting. I mean, number 1, it's really interesting to learn about a lot of those events and stories because you don't learn about them in school. So as I was listening to Jocko's podcast, it was really the first time I was getting introduced to so many of these stories and these horrific atrocities that had happened throughout history. And I always felt like I learned a lot from those podcasts, but it's kind of hard to put into words what you're learning or why you're studying them. And so one of the things I did was I went to the podcast where he covers the book Ordinary Men, which is Jocko Podcast 85. Highly recommend you check it out. But at the beginning of that podcast, I think he does a really good job of explaining why it is important that we take the time to study these atrocities, because they're not fun to study and they're not fun to listen to. And so here we go. This is from Jocko and Jocko Podcast 85. He says, I wish I didn't have to talk about this. I do. I really do. I wish I could talk about nicer things. I wish I could talk about pleasant things and we could just forget about all this horror. But there's the rub, because even though it would be easier and more pleasant to talk about something nice, the problem is that if we forget about these things, then we forget about these things. And if we forget, we don't learn. And if we don't learn about what humans can do and why they do what they do, then we can repeat our mistakes, and that is awful. So we go because we have to go. So I think that's just a really interesting frame. And as I say that, it reminds me of this, quote or wisdom from Charlie Munger. There's even a book that I'll cover on the podcast at some point, but it's titled "All I Want to Know Is Where I'm Going to Die So That I Never Go There." One of the things that Charlie talks about all the time is the importance of inversion, right? If you want to make a successful business, think about all the things that you would do to absolutely ruin the business and make sure you don't do those things. And so he's big on inverting all these different situations to figure out what you should try to do. And as I kind of think about this and the importance of studying atrocities and why is it useful, I'm reminded of that idea from Charlie Munger and Jocko's. Hey, we study these things to understand what leads people to go down the wrong path, and how do we make sure we do everything we can to avoid those paths and understand the lessons learned so that history doesn't repeat itself. And so I think that's something that I really and uniquely appreciate about Jocko, is his willingness to dive into those atrocities from history and be the person that communicates the lessons that we've learned from them so that we don't repeat them. Like I said, these are stories of atrocities that happened in history that I would have never heard of or been introduced to if I hadn't been introduced to them from Jocko. And I still don't quite know how to articulate all the benefit and all the utility there is in studying those atrocities. That's something I'm going to need to work on articulating, but it's definitely there, and I think it's important we study those things. And I'm glad that he does that on his podcast. So with that, we'll close out this podcast. That is 10 lessons at the top of my mind that I've learned from Jocko over the past decade of him putting out content. So last thing I'll say is huge thank you to Jocko for taking the time to write Extreme Ownership, go on those initial podcasts with Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan, and put yourself out there, and then take their advice and make your own podcast yourself. Like I said, I mean, I've listened to thousands of hours of Jocko since the very beginning, and it's had a huge impact on my life. And I feel very lucky that Jocko and his podcast and his train of thought was introduced to me at the time that it was, because it was just it had a huge impact on me. It was the right messages or the right lessons at the right time for me in my life. And I truly feel blessed to have had that timing to where I got to learn these lessons from Jocko. So with that, we'll end this podcast, and I'll see you next time.